What if everything you've been told about investing is costing you money instead of making it? Not because it's wrong, but because you're doing it in the wrong order. And the worst part is you won't realize it until years later. What if the thing you believe is helping you build wealth is actually the reason you're falling behind? I know that sounds extreme, but sit with it for a second. Because I used to feel proud every time I invested. It felt responsible. It felt like I was doing something most people don't do. But at the same time, there was this quiet tension I couldn't explain. Something didn't feel stable underneath it, like I was making progress on the surface while something deeper wasn't adding up. And the more I paid attention, the more uncomfortable it became. I started noticing people who were investing regularly but still living paycheck to paycheck. People chasing returns while carrying debt that was quietly growing faster than anything they owned. It didn't look like failure, it looked like effort. But something about it felt off. Hey everyone, this is Beginner Finance, and the question that kept bothering me was simple but hard to ignore. What if the problem isn't what we're doing with money, but the order we're doing it in? And once that question really settled in my mind, I couldn't stop looking for proof of it in the real world. What I found was honestly unsettling. There's this quiet reality that doesn't get talked about enough. A significant number of people don't even have a basic financial cushion, not enough to handle a small emergency without stress. And yet those same people are actively thinking about how to grow their money, how to invest better, how to chase higher returns. That contradiction kept bothering me because it reveals something deeper than just a lack of discipline or knowledge. It reveals a blind spot. We're focusing on optimization before stability. We're trying to grow something that hasn't been secured yet. And here's the part that really changes how you see it. There's an order to this process that most people never stop to consider. Not just what to do with money, but when each decision actually makes sense. And if you get that sequence wrong, the cost doesn't show up immediately. It builds quietly over time in ways that are hard to measure but impossible to ignore later. That's the part almost nobody sees coming. Because it doesn't feel like a mistake until it's already expensive. And the more I sat with that idea, the more I realized this wasn't just a theory. It was something I had been living without fully understanding it. I've spent an unusual amount of time thinking about money, not in a flashy way, not chasing shortcuts, but trying to understand why things that seem logical don't always lead to real progress. And what kept standing out to me was this quiet pattern. People doing what sounds right, but still feeling stuck. Still feeling pressure, still feeling like something isn't clicking. That's what made me take a step back, not to find a better investment, but to question the structure itself. Because if the structure is off, no amount of optimization on top of it really fixes the problem. It just makes the surface look better while the foundation stays unstable. And if you're someone who actually wants to understand this at a deeper level, not just what to do, but why it works the way it does, then consider subscribing. It really helps support the channel, and it gives me the motivation to keep making content that's honest, thoughtful, and actually useful. Because what I'm about to walk through isn't complicated, but it is something most people overlook. And the simplest way I found to make sense of it was to stop thinking about money as numbers, and start thinking about it as something you build. Imagine you're building a house, but instead of starting with the foundation, you jump straight to the visible parts. You pick out the flooring, the lighting, maybe even the furniture. Everything looks good on the surface. It feels like progress. But underneath, the structure isn't stable. The ground hasn't been reinforced. The roof hasn't been secured. At first, nothing seems wrong. Then something small happens. A crack appears. A leak starts. And suddenly, everything you built on top of that weak base becomes vulnerable. That's what this feels like to me now when I look at how most people handle money. We get excited about investing because it's visible. It feels like forward movement. You can see the numbers change. You can track it. You can talk about it. But the parts that actually determine whether that progress holds are quiet. The foundation, the stability, the protection. Those things don't feel rewarding in the moment. I used to overlook that. I thought progress meant doing more. Moving faster, getting into the market as soon as possible. But now I see it differently. If the structure underneath isn't strong, then everything built on top of it isn't progress. It's exposure. And once I saw it as exposure instead of progress, I started paying attention to something I had been ignoring for a long time: how my behavior changed when money felt tight. There's a difference between making decisions from stability and making decisions from pressure, and I don't think we talk about that enough. When you don't have a financial cushion, everything feels urgent. Every expense becomes a problem to solve immediately. Every decision carries weight. You start thinking in shorter time frames, not because you want to, but because you have to. It's not a lack of discipline, it's a response to scarcity. I've been in that mindset before, and what surprised me is how it quietly reshapes your thinking. You become reactive, you delay decisions that matter, or you make fast decisions just to relieve pressure, even if they cost you more later. That's when the idea of a financial buffer started to feel different to me. Not as a goal, but as a shift in how you operate. Because when you have even a small margin of safety, something changes. You don't panic as easily. You don't rush decisions. You give yourself space to think instead of react. And that space is where better choices come from. It's where long-term thinking becomes possible. Not because your life is perfect, but because your mind is no longer in survival mode. And once you step out of that survival mindset, the numbers start to reveal something you can't ignore anymore. I remember the moment I actually sat down and compared the math honestly, without trying to justify my habits. If a credit card is charging around 20% interest, and a typical long-term investment might return 7 or 8%, there's a gap there that isn't small. It's overwhelming. It means that every dollar I left in debt was quietly undoing the work of every dollar I invested. That realization didn't feel dramatic in the moment. It felt uncomfortable, because it meant I had been focusing on something that looked like growth, while something else was quietly working against me at a faster rate. And that's when I started to see debt differently. Not as a burden to manage, but as a negative investment that compounds just as aggressively as a good one, just in the opposite direction. Paying it off wasn't just a defensive move. It was one of the most predictable returns available to me. There's something grounding about that kind of clarity. No guessing, no hoping, just a direct improvement in your financial position. But then there was one piece that forced me to think a little deeper: employer matching. Because this is one of the few situations where the numbers shift again. If someone is willing to match what you contribute, that's not a gradual return. It's immediate, and that changes the calculation. So the balance became clear to me. Take what's guaranteed, then remove what's working against you. Not randomly, but deliberately, in the right order. And once I started making decisions that way, prioritizing what was guaranteed before what was uncertain, something deeper began to shift in how I saw myself. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about identity. Before, I used to think of myself as someone trying to get ahead by finding the right opportunities, the right investment, the right timing, the right move. There was always this subtle pressure to keep looking, to stay alert, to not miss out. But over time, that mindset started to feel exhausting because it depended on constantly being right. And the more I understood the role of order, the more that approach stopped making sense. I wasn't trying to outsmart the market. I was trying to stop working against myself. That's a very different goal. So I started asking different questions. Not what's the next big opportunity, but what comes next in the sequence. And that question grounded everything. It removed the noise. It made decisions simpler, not easier, but clearer. And slowly, without really noticing it at first, I stopped feeling like someone chasing results and started feeling like someone building a system. A system that doesn't depend on being perfect. A system that holds up even when things don't go exactly as planned. That shift changed how I approached risk. It changed how I thought about progress. And, more importantly, it changed how I measured success. Not by how fast things were growing, but by how stable they had become. And once stability became the metric instead of speed, I started to understand something I had always misunderstood about financial freedom. It's not a number. It's a position. For a long time, I thought freedom meant hitting some distant milestone where everything suddenly changes. A certain net worth, a certain income level, a point where money is no longer a concern. But the more I paid attention to how people actually live, The more I realize that freedom shows up much earlier than that, and in a much quieter way. It shows up in your decisions. It's the moment where you don't feel forced, where you're not constantly negotiating with your limitations, where you can say no to something without immediately worrying about the consequences, where an unexpected expense doesn't disrupt your entire life, where your choices start to reflect what you want, not just what you can afford right now. That shift doesn't come from chasing higher returns. It comes from removing pressure. And that's what this sequence is really doing in the background. Each step isn't just improving your finances, it's reducing constraints. When you eliminate high-interest obligations, you free up your future income. When you use more efficient structures, you keep more of what you earn. When you build a buffer, you create space between you and urgency. And over time, that space turns into something powerful. It becomes what I think of as walking away money. Not in the sense that you're leaving everything behind, but in the sense that you're no longer trapped by your situation. You can walk away from bad decisions, from pressure, from urgency. And that kind of freedom doesn't happen all at once. It builds quietly, step by step, in the background of doing things in the right order. And the part that makes this difficult is how easy it is to ignore all of that once things start feeling better, because the moment you gain a little stability, a little breathing room, there's a strong pull to move faster, to take on more risk, to jump ahead to the parts that feel more exciting again. I felt that myself, that urge to accelerate before the structure is fully ready. But that's where things quietly break. Not because the decisions are obviously wrong, but because they're built on something that hasn't been fully secured yet. It's like adding weight to a structure that hasn't been reinforced. At first, nothing happens. It still stands. It still looks fine. But the stress is building underneath. And when something eventually shifts, the impact is bigger than it needed to be. That's why I've become more cautious about what looks like progress. Because not all progress is real. Some of it is fragile. Some of it depends on everything going perfectly. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that the real risk isn't moving too slowly. It's building on top of something that can't support what you're trying to create, because when the foundation gives way, you don't just lose momentum, you lose time. And when you start thinking about time that way, not just as something that passes, but as something you can either use or quietly lose, the whole conversation changes again. Because at that point, it's no longer just about making better decisions. It's about understanding what those decisions are actually costing you. Not today, but over years. There's something I had to face that wasn't easy to accept. Two people can put in the same effort, invest the same amount of money, follow what looks like a similar path, and still end up in completely different places. Not because one of them was smarter, not because one of them got lucky, but because one of them had a system that supported their progress, and the other one didn't. That difference is subtle at first, almost invisible. But over time, it becomes everything. I remember running through a simple scenario in my head. Nothing extreme. Just consistent investing over a long period of time, the kind of thing most people are told to do. And, on the surface, it looks straightforward. Put money in regularly. Let it grow. Be patient. But what I started to realize is that the environment that money grows in matters just as much as the amount itself. If that money is growing while being pulled down by high-interest obligations, it's like trying to run forward on a moving walkway that's going in the opposite direction. You're putting in effort, but you're not getting the full result of that effort. If that money is being taxed inefficiently year after year, it's like having a small percentage shaved off every time it tries to grow, not enough to feel painful in the moment, but enough to change the final outcome in a meaningful way. And if that money is being interrupted, pulled out early because of emergencies, redirected because of pressure, then the one thing that investing depends on most, time, never gets the chance to do its job. So when you combine all of those small inefficiencies, something surprising happens. You don't just grow slower, you grow differently. And that difference compounds. Let's say two people invest the same amount of money every year for decades. One of them builds a system first. They eliminate high-interest debt. They take advantage of opportunities that offer immediate benefit. They use structures that allow their money to grow more efficiently. They create stability before they chase growth. The other person skips those steps. They invest while carrying expensive debt. They ignore available advantages. They treat investing as the starting point instead of the final layer. At first, their results might look similar. In fact, the second person might even feel like they're moving faster because they jumped into the visible part earlier. But over time, the gap starts to appear, not suddenly, gradually, quietly. And by the time it becomes obvious, it's already large. That's the part that's hard to explain until you see it, because it doesn't feel like a mistake while it's happening. It feels like progress. That's what makes it dangerous. And this is where the idea of opportunity cost becomes real, not as a concept, but as something you can feel. Every dollar has a direction. Every decision has a trade-off. And when you do things out of order, you're not just making a neutral choice. You're choosing a path where your effort produces less than it could have. You're choosing to delay momentum. You're choosing to accept friction that doesn't need to exist. And the frustrating part is none of this shows up in a way that forces you to stop. There's no moment where everything breaks and tells you to start over. It just continues, slightly inefficient, slightly misaligned, until years later you look back and realize how much further you could have been. And that's when it really hits. Because by then, it's not about fixing one decision. It's about understanding a pattern of doing things that feel right in the moment, but don't fully support the outcome you actually want. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've come to see that the biggest risk in money isn't taking the wrong opportunity. It's building your entire approach on the wrong sequence. Because when the sequence is off, even good decisions lose some of their power. Even consistent effort produces weaker results. And over time, that becomes the difference between feeling like you're making progress and actually making it. So when I step back now, I don't think about investing as the starting point anymore. I think about it as the final expression of everything that came before it. The result of stability. The result of removing what works against you. The result of putting yourself in a position where growth can actually happen. And when you approach it that way, something changes. You're no longer trying to force outcomes. You're allowing them. You're not relying on being right all the time. You're building something that works even when you're not. And that, to me, feels like a much more honest way to think about money. Not as a race, not as a game of finding the next opportunity, but as a process of putting the right pieces in place, in the right order. Because in the end, it's not just about how much you invest. It's about whether your system allows that investment to become what it's capable of becoming. And that's the difference that most people don't see until it's already cost them. When I step back and look at everything we've walked through, one truth becomes hard to ignore. Most people are not failing because they lack discipline, intelligence, or opportunity. They're falling behind because they're building in the wrong order. They're trying to grow before they stabilize, optimize before they protect, and accelerate before they understand what's holding them back. And over time, that creates a quiet friction that compounds just as powerfully as progress. The difference between moving forward and feeling stuck often isn't about how much you do, but whether each step actually supports the next one. When the sequence is right, even small actions start to build momentum. When it's wrong, even strong effort gets diluted. That's why the real shift isn't about finding better investments. It's about building a structure that allows those investments to work the way they're supposed to. The deeper lesson here is simple, but not easy. Before you focus on growing your money, focus on removing what's working against it. Create stability. Eliminate high-friction debt. Use smarter structures. Then, and only then, think about expansion. If you apply this in your life today, start by asking one honest question. Is your next financial move actually in the right order? So I'd love to hear from you. Where do you think you are right now in this sequence? Drop your answer in the comments so everyone can learn from different perspectives. And if this helped you think differently about money, consider subscribing to support the channel. so I can keep creating more thoughtful content like this.